The vote was not close. It was not even a debate worth remembering. When the final tally was read aloud in the grand chamber of the Galactic Council, the numbers sat like a stone dropped into still water: 217 member civilizations in favor of Earth's removal, 1 abstention, and exactly 1 vote against. That single dissenting vote belonged to Earth itself, cast by Ambassador Yara Asay, sat perfectly still in her chair as the result echoed across the chamber's curved walls. She did not cry. She did not raise her voice. She simply closed her data tablet, folded her hands on the table, and looked at the presiding council elder, a tall, violet-skinned Varathi named Counselor Dresh, with the kind of calm that made him shift uncomfortably in his seat. Ambassador Asay, Dresh said carefully, "The decision of the council is final. Earth's membership is hereby suspended, pending review, which will commence no sooner than 50 standard cycles from today." 50 cycles. In human terms, that was roughly 62 years. Yara nodded once. "Understood," she said. Then she stood, collected her tablet, and walked out of the chamber without another word. No protest. No plea. No dramatic speech. Just footsteps, growing quieter, until the enormous doors closed behind her with a sound like a slow exhale. The reason for the vote, officially recorded in council archives, was listed under 3 headings: unauthorized military expansion, failure to comply with the Armament Reduction Accord, and most controversially, what the council called cultural destabilization of developing species. That last charge had been pushed hard by the hegemony of Vox, a bloc of 12 powerful civilizations who had long viewed humanity's rapid spread across unclaimed star systems as a threat dressed up as exploration. What the charges did not mention, because politics rarely mentions the real thing, was fear. Simple, ancient, universal fear. Humanity had joined the Galactic Council just over 100 years ago, arriving not with a single colony ship or a diplomatic drone, but with 47 populated worlds already behind them. They had not waited for an invitation. They had not asked permission to settle uninhabited systems. They had simply gone and built and lived, and then one day shown up at the council's door with 47 seats worth of people and said, politely but firmly, that they would like to be part of the conversation now. The council had let them in, because the alternative, conflict with a species that had colonized 47 worlds in under 3 centuries, seemed unwise. But letting them in was not the same as trusting them, and over the decades, that distrust had grown into something harder. Humans were strange, not in ways that were easy to point to, but in ways that accumulated. They adapted too quickly. They formed alliances too easily. They had a habit of looking at a problem everyone else had declared unsolvable and coming back 3 years later with a solution that nobody had thought to try, because it required doing something that seemed, on its face, completely unreasonable. They laughed at things that weren't funny, cried at things that weren't sad, and had once memorably convinced an entire pre-contact civilization to voluntarily delay their industrial revolution by 6 generations simply by telling them stories. That last incident was what had become the cultural destabilization charge, though the civilization in question had later sent formal gratitude to Earth for saving their biosphere. The council had never quite forgiven them for that, so when the hegemony of Vox drafted the removal motion and began quietly gathering signatures, it found a surprisingly willing audience. Not because most civilizations hated humanity, but because most civilizations were tired of being made to feel slow, Earth received the formal notice of removal, a standard diplomatic channel. A long document full of legal language that essentially said, "You are no longer welcome at the table. Please hand in your credentials, your council seats will be redistributed, and we wish you well in your future independent endeavors." The response from Earth's unified government came exactly 72 hours later. It was 3 sentences long. "We acknowledge receipt of the Council's decision. We will comply with the procedural requirements of separation within the standard window. We look forward to seeing what the galaxy looks like in 62 years. That was it. No anger, no threats, no request for appeal. The hegemony of Vox read the response and declared it a victory. Several of their spokespeople gave speeches about the restoration of galactic order and the importance of cooperation over unilateral expansion. The Council's media channels ran favorable coverage. For about 2 weeks, everything felt like it had been resolved. Then Earth started leaving, not fleeing, not retreating. Just quietly, efficiently, systematically pulling out of every shared infrastructure project they had been part of. Trade lanes they had helped maintain began experiencing minor delays. 3 deep space relay stations that humanity had built and operated as a contribution to Council communication. Networks went offline for scheduled maintenance and did not come back. A joint research initiative on faster-than-light travel, which had been running for 30 years and was considered the most advanced program of its kind in the known galaxy, suddenly lost its 31 human researchers, all of whom resigned on the same day, citing change in institutional direction. None of it was illegal. Every single withdrawal was within the bounds of the separation agreement. Earth had, apparently, read the fine print very carefully before signing anything. The Council's Infrastructure Committee filed a complaint. The hegemony of Vox called it petty. A few smaller member civilizations, ones who had quietly benefited from Earth's presence without ever loudly supporting them, began making private inquiries about whether any of the withdrawn services might be restored through bilateral agreement. Earth's new Office of Independent Relations responded to each inquiry politely, professionally, and with a clear and consistent answer: yes, we would be happy to discuss that. However, as we are no longer Council members, all arrangements will need to be negotiated as independent treaties, subject to Earth's own terms, their own terms. That phrase landed differently depending on who read it. To the hegemony of Vox, it sounded like arrogance. To the smaller civilizations, it sounded like an open door. To Councillor Dresch, sitting in his office on the Council's central station, reading the latest report from his diplomatic staff, it sounded like something he had not expected. It sounded like a plan. He called for a private meeting with 2 of his most trusted advisors, a Garati systems analyst named Pell and an ancient D-Link diplomat who had been practicing interstellar politics for longer than most civilizations had been spacefaring. He laid the reports on the table between them and asked, simply, what they thought. Pell ran the numbers. The relay station losses alone would increase communication latency across 40% of Council space by a margin significant enough to affect real-time military coordination. The FTL research program, without its human contributors, was projected to fall behind its timeline by an estimated 18 to 23 years. The Thaline diplomat, whose name translated roughly as one who watches tides, read everything slowly, set it down, and was quiet for a long time. Did anyone, she said at last, think to ask what the humans were going to do next? Nobody had. It had not seemed like a necessary question. They had been removed. They had complied. The assumption, the very comfortable and completely unexamined assumption, had been that without the Council, humanity would simply continue existing in a smaller way, that they would manage their own worlds, trade among themselves, and gradually fade from galactic relevance. They colonized 47 worlds before we knew their name, the Thaline said quietly. They built relay stations we now depend on. They were 3 years from a breakthrough in FTL travel that none of our other species have come close to replicating. She folded her long fingers together, and we voted to make them angry. They don't seem angry, Pell said. No, she agreed. They seem busy. That is considerably worse. Outside the Council station's wide observation windows, the stars were the same as they had always been, cold, distant, indifferent to politics. But somewhere out there, across dozens of human-settled worlds, in research stations and shipyards and government offices, people were quietly, methodically, and without any apparent hurry. Getting to work, nobody knew yet what they were working on. That would turn out to be the most unsettling part of all. The first treaty signed after Earth's removal from the Council was with the Solhari Compact, a cluster of 4 small civilizations nestled along the outer edge of the spur arm who had always been too minor, too quiet, and too far from the center of things to matter much in Council politics. They had voted for Earth's removal not because they wanted to, but because abstaining would have drawn attention from the hegemony of Vox, and the Solhari had learned long ago that drawing attention was dangerous when you were small. The treaty they signed with Earth 3 months after the removal covered 6 specific areas: agricultural technology exchange, joint medical research, communication, infrastructure development, shared early warning systems for stellar hazards, educational exchange programs, and something listed in the appendix as cooperative resource mapping of uncharted systems. That last item was quiet. It's understated. Buried under 5 pages of agricultural clauses, most council analysts who reviewed the document didn't look at it twice. They should have looked at it twice. Within 8 months, 12 more such treaties had been signed. Not with major civilizations, not yet, but with the kind of smaller, overlooked species that tended to fall through the cracks of council politics. The kind who had resource-rich systems that the council had never prioritized developing. The kind who had been promised infrastructure assistance for decades and were still waiting. Earth showed up with actual engineers, actual equipment, and timelines measured in years rather than decades. And the treaties signed themselves. Councillor Dresch received the reports one by one and felt a slow, creeping unease that he couldn't quite name. Nothing Earth was doing was aggressive. Nothing was threatening. It was, in the most irritating possible way, entirely peaceful. They were just helping people. But the pattern of who they were helping and where those civilizations were located and what resources existed in those regions of space, that pattern, when Pell mapped it out on a star chart, looked uncomfortably like the early stages of something very large and very deliberate. It could be coincidence, Pell offered. Without much conviction, it isn't, Dresch said. Meanwhile, on Earth itself and across its settled worlds, things were changing in ways that were harder to track from the outside. The unified government had quietly reorganized several of its departments in the months following removal. The Department of Interstellar Relations had been expanded enormously and renamed the Office of Independent. Civilizational Development, a name so bland and bureaucratic that it attracted essentially no attention. The military's deep space exploration division had received a budget increase that was technically public record but buried in a 7,000-page infrastructure spending bill that no Foreign Intelligence Service had bothered to read in full. 3 new shipyards had broken ground in systems that Earth had settled in the past 20 years. Not military shipyards, officially. Officially, they were listed as multi-purpose vessel construction and maintenance facilities, but the specifications for those facilities, if anyone had thought to request and cross-reference them with known construction parameters, would have revealed that they were built to accommodate ships considerably larger than anything Earth currently operated. Nobody thought to request and cross-reference them. This was partly because Earth had always been forthright with information during its time on the Council, which had created a habit of not looking too carefully, and partly because the hegemony of Vox was busy declaring victory, and had little appetite for complicated follow-up questions. The person who finally started asking the right questions was not a government official or a military analyst. She was a freelance journalist named Sira Yunsho, a human who had spent the last 15 years living and working aboard the Council's central station, writing long-form pieces for a publication that was read, 2 varying degrees of attention across about 60 civilizations. She had been in the press gallery on the day of the vote. She had watched Yara say walk out of the chamber. And she had noticed, in that moment of stillness before the doors closed, something that nobody else seemed to have caught. Yara Say had been smiling. Very slightly, almost not at all. But Sira had been watching people's faces in high-pressure moments for 20 years, and she knew the difference between someone who had been defeated and someone who had just watched something begin. It took her 4 months to get an interview. Earth's new diplomatic office was polite but extremely busy and not particularly interested in council-affiliated press. When the interview finally happened, it was not with Yara Say, who had returned to Earth and largely disappeared from public view, but with a mid-level official in the Office of Independent Civilizational Development named Thomas Ferrara, who had the pleasant, unremarkable manner of someone who had been specifically chosen to say nothing interesting. He said a great deal of nothing interesting for about 40 minutes. Then Sira asked directly what Earth was actually building. Farah smiled. It was the same kind of smile Yara Asay had worn walking out of the chamber. Small. Almost nothing. We're building relationships, he said. The shipyards, Sarah said. The resource mapping. The treaties with the outer armed civilizations. What are you actually doing? Ambassador Asay said something when she came home from the council, Farah said, in the tone of a man offering a gift. She said that for 100 years humanity had been trying to fit itself into a structure that was built before we arrived, and that the most valuable thing the council had ever done for us was remind us that we didn't need their structure. We had 100 years of experience. We had 50 worlds. We had the best FTL research program in the known galaxy, which we now own outright, and we had 62 years in which nobody was going to tell us what to do. That's not an answer, Sira said.
No.
Ferreira agreed pleasantly. But it's the truth. The interview was published a week later and was the most widely read piece Sira had written in her career. It was shared across council networks, translated into 47 languages, and discussed in the chambers of at least a dozen member civilizations. The hegemony of Vox issued a brief statement calling it speculative and sensationalist. Several council members called for a formal inquiry into Earth's activities. The inquiry was approved, assigned to a committee, and promptly became lost in the procedural machinery that tended to swallow things the council found uncomfortable. But the unease had taken root. Because the thing about the interview, the thing that nobody could quite explain away, was how calm Ferrara had been. How entirely unbothered. He hadn't been defensive, hadn't been evasive in the way people were evasive when they were hiding something shameful. He had been evasive in the way people were evasive when they were holding something good and weren't ready to show it yet. 6 weeks after the interview, the FTL research team published a paper. It came through a private academic channel, not the council's scientific network, and it was co-authored by 17 of the 31 researchers who had resigned from the joint program. The paper was dense, technical, written in a way that assumed the reader had an advanced understanding of exotic matter, dynamics and quantum gravitational field theory. Most readers did not. But the researchers who did understand it went very quiet for a long time after finishing it, and then started making calls to colleagues. The paper described a theoretical framework for a new kind of propulsion, not faster than the current FTL standard, not slightly faster. The numbers, if correct, suggested something roughly 4 times faster than anything currently in operation across all known civilizations, with an energy requirement that was actually lower than existing drives. Not higher it was, depending on who you asked. Either the most important scientific publication in a generation or a collection of very ambitious mistakes. The academic debate that followed was immediate, loud, showed no signs of resolving quickly. What was not debated, what everyone, regardless of position on the science, quietly agreed on, was the timing. The paper had been sitting in someone's files for a while. It had been released now, through a non-council channel, in a way that made it simultaneously public knowledge and completely outside the council's ability to control or claim any stake in. Dresch read the paper. He didn't understand most of it. He called Pell, who understood all of it, and whose expression when she arrived at his office was one he had not seen on her face before. "If this is real," she said, "and I think it might be real, then in 10 years, humanity will be able to cross distances it currently takes us 40 years to cross." Dresch sat with that for a moment. "The outer armed civilizations," he said slowly. "The ones signing treaties with Earth right now, they would all be within very easy reach." "Within easy reach of Earth," Pell said. "And very far from us. The stars outside the window had not moved. They never did, on any human scale of time. But the distances between them, which had always felt like protection, like a buffer against whatever strange thing humanity might become if left to its own devices, those distances suddenly felt less reassuring than they had the day before. 12 years after Earth's removal from the Galactic Council, a ship arrived at the Council's central station that nobody had been expecting. It was not a military vessel. It was not armed, not visibly. It followed all standard approach protocols with the kind of practiced precision that suggested it had done this many times before. What made the station's traffic control team pause was its size, and its designation, and the small flag on its hull, Earth's flag. A blue circle on white, which had not been officially displayed on this station in over a decade. The ship was called the Meridian, and it was, by any measurement that mattered, unlike anything currently operating in Council space. It was not sleek in the decorative sense, it was sleek in the engineering sense. Everything shaped around function, nothing wasted, the lines of it suggesting speed and range and endurance rather than status. It was about 3 times the size of the largest Council diplomatic vessel, and it had, according to the passive scans that the station ran on all approaching ships, a drive signature that matched nothing in the existing database. The crew that came aboard were 12 humans, and this was the part that made the receiving officer check her scanner twice. Representatives from 7 different species, none of which were Council members. The Solhari Compact was there. So were the Dravani of the Outer Arm, who had until recently been considered a pre-contact species. So was a small copper-skinned being that the station's species database did not recognize at all. Listed on the manifest simply as an observer from the Tereth Cooperative. Nobody in the Council had heard of the Tereth Cooperative. The head of the Earth delegation was a man named Ambassador Kale Osei, the son of Yara Osei, which was not a coincidence and not subtle. And humanity had apparently decided they were done pretending it was. He was tall, relaxed, dressed in clothes that were clearly formal, but in a style the Council's fashion analysts could not immediately categorize, because it drew from at least 4 different cultural traditions and wore all of them easily. He greeted the receiving delegation with perfect diplomatic courtesy, requested a meeting with the Council's senior chamber at their earliest convenience, and then went to his assigned quarters and, by all accounts, slept for 8 hours without apparent concern. The Council convened an emergency session that evening. Dresch, older now, read through the delegation manifest with the focused expression of a man trying very hard not to show that he was alarmed. The Dravani had been on the Council's protected species list, a designation meaning they were pre-contact, and not to be approached by spacefaring civilizations. That list was a Council rule. Earth was no longer bound by Council rules. They made contact with the Dravani, said Representative Chalush of the Vox Hegemony, and the word contact carried about 14 different accusatory meanings. The Dravani are sitting at their table, Councillor Dresch replied, and the word there was doing a lot of work. The meeting request was granted for the following morning. The senior chamber filled to capacity, not just with Council representatives, but with attaches and analysts and at least a dozen press credentials. Because news of the Meridian's arrival had spread across the station and ours, Sira Yuncho was in the press gallery. She had been waiting for this moment, in one form or another. For 12 years, Ambassador Kalose walked in with his delegation, arranged themselves on the visiting side of the great chamber table, and opened with a sentence that nobody had anticipated. "We're not here to rejoin the Council," he said. A very specific kind of silence followed that statement, the kind that happens when a room full of people simultaneously revise their mental model of the situation. "We are here," he continued calmly, "to introduce the Interstellar Cooperative Assembly. The ICA currently has 31 member civilizations and is formally ratified under its own charter, which was signed 14 months ago. The Solhari Compact, the Dravani, the Tereth Cooperative, and 28 other sovereign civilizations are full members. Earth serves as the founding member and hosts the Assembly's primary coordination office. But all members have equal vote on all matters affecting shared resources, security, and development." He paused to let that settle. "We are not a competing government," he said. "We don't intend to be. We are here today as a courtesy, to inform the Council of the ICA's existence and to open a formal channel for dialogue between our two bodies, should the Council wish one." Jalish of the Vox Hegemony found his voice first. "The Dravani were under protected status. Earth violated the Dravani, sent us a message," Kale said simply. 14 years ago, before our removal. through a communication method they developed independently, using a frequency that our listening arrays happened to be monitoring. It was a deliberate contact attempt. We responded. We introduced ourselves slowly over several years, in accordance with their own pace and preferences. They applied for ICA membership 7 months ago. We accepted. He looked at Chalice steadily. The Council's protected species designation was a council rule, designed for council members. We were not a council member. The Dravani were not a council member. No rule was broken. The legal team would spend 3 weeks confirming that this was technically correct. The session continued for 4 hours and covered a great deal of ground, most of it uncomfortable. The council asked about the ICA's military arrangements. Kale described a mutual defense framework, not a military alliance in the traditional sense, but a commitment that an attack on any ICA member would be treated as a matter of collective concern. No specific response was guaranteed. No specific response was ruled out. The council asked about the new propulsion technology. Kale confirmed that EICA member civilizations had access to it under a shared development agreement. He confirmed that the Meridian was running a second-generation version of the drive. He did not provide technical details because they had not been requested through proper channels. And if the council wished to request them, there was a formal process for that through the bilateral dialogue framework he had just offered. The council asked, finally, about the Tereth Cooperative. Who were they? Where were they? How many? Kale smiled. Not his mother's controlled, careful smile, but something warmer and more open. The Tereth Cooperative consists of 11 civilizations located in the region you currently map as uncharted deep space, approximately 600 light-years from this station. They have been spacefaring for about 800 years. They chose not to contact the council because, and I'm quoting their spokesperson here, they found the council's membership requirements philosophically incompatible with their governance model. He tilted his head slightly. They applied to the ICA because our requirements are different. Nobody asked what the ICA's requirements were, but Sira Yuncho, in the press gallery, wrote it down as her first question for the follow-up interview she was already planning. After the session, walking back through the station's main corridor toward the docking bay, one of Kale's aides, a young Solhari woman named Vesa, who had grown up in a system that now had Earth-built hospitals and relay stations, fell into step beside him and asked what she had been wondering all morning. Do you think they'll want to talk? The council. Do you think they'll open the dialogue? Kale considered the question with genuine thought, not dismissal. Some of them will, he said. The smaller ones, who were never comfortable with how things were run. A few of the older ones who are smart enough to see where this is going, not the hegemony. Not for a while, he paused. But here's the thing about the council's situation right now. And this is the thing my mother understood. The day she walked out of this building 12 years ago, they need us more than we need them. And they know it. And we know they know it. And they know we know they know it. Vesa thought about that. So what do? We wait, Kale said. We're patient. We've always been patient when it matters. He glanced back once at the great chamber doors, then looked forward again. My mother used to say that the most powerful thing you can be, in any negotiation, is the one who genuinely doesn't need the other person to say. Yes, the Meridian undocked 3 days later and slipped out of council space with the quiet efficiency of something built to move through the dark over very long distances. The council watched it go on their tracking systems until the drive signature. Unlike anything their instruments had been calibrated to follow, simply vanished from the screen, not destroyed, not cloaked. Just gone faster than they could watch. That, more than anything else that had happened in those 3 days, was the thing that sat in the back of everyone's mind afterward, quiet and persistent. Like the low hum of a system you can't quite locate the source of. The crisis, when it came, was not manufactured by Earth. That fact was important, and the Council's own investigation would later confirm it. Though the confirmation arrived well after the moment it would have mattered most, it began with a star. Specifically, it began with a star in the Dervan system, which was home to a pre-industrial civilization of about 900 million beings, called the Dervan Kai, who had no spaceflight, no radio communication. and no awareness whatsoever that the rest of the galaxy existed. They were a protected species under Council designation, which meant that a small, automated monitoring buoy had been parked in their outer system for the past 80 years, recording stellar data, and pinging the Council's network every 30 days with a status report, 30-8 days after the Iridian's visit to the Council station. The Dervan system's star began showing the early signatures of an irregular flare cycle. Not catastrophic, not immediately, but the models were clear that within 14 to 18 months, a flare event would occur that would strip a significant portion of the Dervankai's atmospheric ozone layer and render their planet's surface essentially uninhabitable inside of 2 years. The automated buoy faithfully reported this. The report went into the Council's monitoring queue. The monitoring queue, as it turned out, had a backlog. The Galactic Council's early warning and response division had been quietly deteriorating for several years, partly due to budget redistribution following the loss of the 3 human-built relay stations, which had, among other functions, provided the computing infrastructure that processed incoming stellar data in real time. The degraded system had moved the Dervan report to a secondary processing tier. It sat there for 22 days before a junior analyst flagged it. By the time it reached a senior officer who could authorize a response, another 9 days had passed. The Council's emergency response protocol for a stellar threat event was a 44-step process requiring sign-off from 7 different departments. It was designed to be thorough. It was not designed to be fast. 11 days into the authorization process, with the flare timeline now down to 13 months, a council member from one of the Outer Arm civilizations made a private call that was not technically against any rule. Because no rule had ever anticipated the situation, she called the ICA. The response was not immediate. It was fast. Within 6 hours, the ICA's coordination office had routed the information to its assessment team. Within 24 hours, an ICA survey vessel was en route to the Dervan system, running on second-generation FTL drives that covered the distance in 4 days, rather than the 16 it would have taken a council ship. Within 2 weeks, a full ICA emergency assessment team was in the outer system, running detailed modeling on the flare event. In a preliminary framework for intervention, options had been distributed to all 31 ICA member civilizations. For review, the Council's authorization process was still on step 20-9. What followed over the next 10 months became one of the most discussed events in recent galactic history, not because of what it revealed about the IC capabilities, though that was remarkable enough, but because of what it revealed about how things actually worked when an emergency came calling. The ICA's intervention was elegant in the specific way that only becomes possible when you combine very good science with very fast ships in a decision-making structure that did not require 7 departmental sign-offs. They could not stop the stellar flare. Nothing could do that. But they could do something that the Council's initial response plan had not even considered. Because the Council's initial response plan had been written by people who were thinking about evacuation, which required getting 900 million pre-contact beings onto ships that they had never seen, at a pace that was impossible. The ICA's plan was different. It was a shield, a network of atmospheric processing satellites positioned at specific orbital points, designed to counteract the ozone depletion by synthesizing and releasing a stabilizing compound in the upper atmosphere. The technology was not new. It had been developed by one of the Tereth cooperative civilizations 40 years ago for a similar problem in their home region of space. Earth's engineers had refined it for faster deployment. The Solhari had contributed the manufacturing capacity. 3 other ICA members had provided materials from resource-rich systems that the Council had never prioritized. Developing the first satellite went up 9 months into the operation. The full network was operational 11 days before the flare event. The Dervankai never knew any of it had happened. They looked up at a sky that turned a little strange for a few weeks. Strange colors in the upper atmosphere, occasional odd lights at night, and eventually wrote stories and songs about it. In their mythology, it became the time when something they had no word for had passed very close to the world and moved on without stopping. The Council finished its Authorization process 17 days after the flare event. Concluded, Dresch did not issue a public statement about the timeline. He did not need to. The timeline was already public. Sira Yuncho's long-form report on the Dervan intervention was already the most widely circulated piece of journalism to come out of the region in a decade. And it had made the comparison between the two responses in terms that were precise, factual, and devastating. Private communications between council members in the following months ranged from defensive to genuinely alarmed. And for the first time in 12 years, the defensive ones were in the minority. Because the thing about the Dervan situation was that it hadn't been about power. It hadn't been about territory or resources or influence. It had been 900 million beings who didn't even know the galaxy existed. And one organization had saved them while the other one was still filling out forms. 3 Council civilizations submitted formal applications to open bilateral dialogue with the ICA within 6 weeks of Sira's report. Not defecting from the Council, not yet. But making it clear that they intended to have a relationship with the ICA, regardless of what the hegemony of Vox thought about it. The hegemony issued 2 strong statements, condemning what they called the ICA's unilateral action in a protected system. The statements were widely noted and less widely agreed with than the hegemony had grown accustomed to. The formal dialogue channel that Kalos had offered, which the Council had left open but unused for 12 years, saw its first official communication shortly after. It was a message from Dresch himself, addressed to the ICA Coordination Office, requesting a meeting. The ICA's response came back within a day. It accepted the meeting request, proposed a neutral station in a system equidistant from both Council space and ICA territory, and suggested a date that was 6 weeks out. Then, in a final line that was not strictly necessary and had clearly been added with some deliberateness, it noted that Ambassador Yara Ose had agreed to attend as a senior advisor. Dresch read that last line twice. He remembered the chamber. He remembered the vote, the numbers, the sound of the doors. He remembered thinking, in the days afterward, that it had been handled cleanly, that the problem had been resolved. He thought about what the Thaline diplomat, one who watches tides, had said, that they had voted to make humanity angry, and that the dangerous part wasn't the anger. The dangerous part was the productivity. He sent his confirmation of attendance. 6 weeks later, in a station that had been specifically built for the meeting quickly, efficiently, by a construction crew that managed to finish it 5 days ahead of schedule in a way that nobody on the Council could quite explain. Yara Say and Councillor Dresch sat across a table from each other for the first time in over 20 years. She was older. He was considerably older. The room around them was designed deliberately, without the raised tiers and dominant central position of the Council chamber, circular. Equal, nobody at the head. Ase placed a single document on the table between them. It was not a demand. It was not a treaty draft. It was a simple summary of what the ICA was, what it had built, and what it was prepared to offer in terms of genuine cooperation on a basis of equality, not membership, not hierarchy, not any of the structures that had made humanity feel for 100 years. Like a guest who had not quite been given a seat at the table they'd helped build. "We never wanted to leave," she said quietly. "We wanted to be treated like we had a right to be there. Those are very different things."
Ow.
Dresch looked at the document for a long moment. Outside the station's windows, both the Council's space and the ICA's expanding territory stretched in every direction, vast and cold and full of civilizations who were watching this. Conversation with the particular. Attention of beings who understood that what happened in this room would matter for a very long time. "Understand that now," he said. It was not an apology. It was not by itself enough. Both of them knew that. But it was a start, and starts had their own weight in the long history of the galaxy, which had always moved slowly, right up until the moments when it didn't, outside among the stars. 31 civilizations went about their days in systems that had better hospitals, faster ships, cleaner water, and futures that looked more stable than they had a decade ago, not because someone powerful had decided to help them, but because a group of people who had been shown the door